What if the biggest threat to education isn't culture? It's that we're still running our academic model like it's 1985 or 1885. We may look successful on paper, but quietly lose our students in the classroom because we've mistaken coverage for learning and tradition for effectiveness. This is I Demand a Meeting, a podcast where two educators in private schools talk honestly about leadership, teaching, and the things we don't normally talk about in staff meetings. I'm Jesse, and that's Jared. And we're going to talk academics. Jared, you and I have talked about this. We touched on academics in episode 1, but one of the things that you and I have both resolved as we've been 20 years looking into all of these things, that the current academic model may not be or isn't working anymore. Give us an example of where that may be the case.
We still have, if we're honest, not all of our schools, but most of our schools are still kind of in that one size fits all approach. And so personalization, it may not really be the goal of our conversation over the next few episodes, but we have to realize that the consumer, including the student and the parent, believe that education is for their specific child. And that's just how the worldview has changed. It didn't used to be like that. And I think we find ourselves in a situation now where parents expect education to be tailored somewhat towards their child.
Yeah, and I think that is just a downstream reflection of most people's views on society. Individualistic, a bit consumeristic, seeking after what we want and making sure we get it and those kind of things. But give us some examples of what that actually looks like in the classroom then.
So we spoke with Dr. Sachs, I think there was an episode 3 or 4, about the escalation of students with learning differences over the last few decades. And so on one end of answering your question is that what has fundamentally changed is we're moving towards a situation where it's not a minority, it's almost the majority of our students have some type of learning difference. Or another way to spin that whole thing, and I don't mean to minimize true disabilities and things of that nature, but all of us, Jesse, you and I included, we learn best in certain ways. And so society is trending that way. So now what used to be reserved, if you will, for students with significant learning differences is now just becoming more mainstream. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we're just learning how to better educate our students. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum where you have high achieving, knocking it out of the park, as if I got this answer 5 minutes ago kind of kids. They're all jumbled in the same classroom most of the time, depending upon the grade level that we're talking about. And so the one size fits all that even Jesse, you and I, not that long ago, 20 years, when we were trained how to be teachers, we were kind of taught the same model. You plan your unit out. You have lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have probably some kind of pre-test or some way to kind of see where the kids are, but you really don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And then you test them at the end of it. You throw a grade in maybe a paper or online grade book back then and do it again for unit 2. And so that hasn't really changed, but I do think the pressures and the learning styles have immensely changed, putting a ton of pressure that something's got to break.
Yeah, that idea of teaching to the middle is a phrase that we hear regularly. And I always casually, jokingly say, but there's some truth to it. If you teach to the middle, you're leaving 2/3 out because there's maybe 1/3 who's not quite there with you yet and ready to go. And there's 1/3 who's already got it mastered and is ready for the next thing. And so you referenced laying out a unit. Say you're going to do your pre-test, post-test, but you have also assumed in there that an arbitrary timeline that every student is going to some degree, demonstrate mastery within the amount of time that you've determined it should take, whether that unit is 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks. But the old model assumes that everyone moves at the same pace, but that's not the reality with the minds of today's learners anymore.
I think what you just said is something that every school, public or private, has to really think through. And that is, if society's demands are changing, then what can I do realistically as a school leader, a school teacher, and so on, to try and meet students where they are? I think pretty much every school would say, we try to meet the needs of our students. I mean, who's not going to say that? but the reality is, how does it actually work in the classroom? So one thing, Jesse, practically speaking, that's changed, I remember talking to various teachers over the years that would say something like, well, Jared, when we're talking about, let's say it's a reading textbook or a math textbook, kind of your anchor book for the class, and you start looking at standards or learning targets, as we call them in the industry, the things that we want kids to actually be able to do by some time in the future. And if you work with the teacher might say, well, Jared, we don't get to that chapter in the book because we run out of time. It's the end of the school year. And so rhetorically, and then I'll even ask the question, I'll say, well, what if the stuff at the end of the book is more important than what's in the middle or the front? And so, again, there's been generations of us as educators, if we're honest, we're just so programmed. The school leadership gives me a book, I start and I go as far as I can. There might be some, depending on how much crazy my class is that year, I just go where I can go. And, over time, we've done things like we got scope and sequences, which for those that are listening, what that means is what the first grade teacher is doing is going to be lined up with a second grade teacher. 10th grade English teacher is going to be lined up with a junior level English teacher. So we have made some strides as a system, but the heart of the issue remains is that we think covering material is somehow the end all be all, when I would argue, as we'll lay out here in the next few episodes, it's more about the learner and less about the content I'm starting with.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So you build out the scope and sequence of what you think you can get through in a year, but then there's got to be some level of responsiveness, flexibility, knowing. It takes a deep knowing your learners, your students, and at the micro level of each individual, but also at the macro of kind of feeling for your class and where you can push, where you can pull, where you may need to pull back and spend a little extra time, and then where you can condense and move forward. And it just takes an active knowing, but that has to be in concert with breaking away from the curriculum guide, the pacing guide. I do 1.1 on Monday, 1.2 on Tuesday, and those kind of things. Now you gotta get somewhere, because eventually you get to the senior year and graduation, and there's a set of essential skills that students may need to be successful for college. So that progression just keeps going. But yeah, there needs to be a little bit of flexibility with that.
I think one of the best illustrations I've found as a framework for us to present to our audience about thinking about how we educate our students is no different from my years, not as a very good one, but when I was coaching various sports. And I've coached kindergarten, if you call that coaching, more loose management, if you will, chaos in order, all the way up through varsity level athletes. And I can tell you from my experience, coaching requires a constant back and forth of knowing the athletes you're coaching and what they need at that time and space. That kind of mindset is not foreign to education, but it's a very difficult thing for a lot of teachers to grasp and school leaders. It's because we think, again, more of that mass conveyor belt product. I start in this chapter, do this chapter, this one, I move on. And that's just how we're kind of programmed to think. And so, Jesse, you're right. We do need some planning, of course. Just like in coaching, you plan out a practice plan. The thing that's different with coaching is that any good coach would say, well, here's my program, but every year you have different players. So depending upon their age and their skill level, you may take them a little further or have to slow down and pause a little more. And sometimes we'll get into more of the strategies on this. Sometimes it's not a matter of throwing all the curriculum out and just saying, well, I'm just going to park it here because these kids can't add fractions. I'm going to stay here for 3 months. Well, that's not what I'm trying to address. But I am trying to address being sensitive to that constant feedback you get, just like a coach would. If you're practicing a skill, let's say it's blocking in football, you go 2, 3, 4 days of blocking, you work different techniques, then you see it repped in a game, which I might call like an assessment in the classroom. And then you give more feedback after the assessment, after that game, and say, all right, what went well? What do we have to tweak? Now let's add this layer on and keep going. And I think that's the mind shift that has to change in our educational landscape for our kids.
Yeah, I've heard it, that analogy of imagine shooting a free throw and not knowing for a week if you made it or not.
That's good.
Yeah, and that's in terms of feedback and grading and stuff. And then, the same idea. Oh, go ahead,
Jesse. I was going to tell you, this. Speaking of timing, for a lot of tests, when you and I grew up, and even some more recent tests, we have students taking nationalized assessments that a school might not get back for 6, 8, 10, 12 months, as if that's going to have anything to do with instruction. And so that model of kind of archaic timing and feedback is so foreign to how quickly society moves these days. We need more immediate feedback to survive and advance in education.
And kind of going back to the idea of constant feedback, checking in, knowing your learners and where they're going. There's that leadership proverb that says, if you're leading but no one's following, you're just taking a walk. And I've kind of modified that to say, if you're teaching but no one's learning, you're just talking to yourself. And I think that's really important to remember, that I'll always use the phrase teaching and learning, because I think they go hand in hand, because we have to ensure that the students are actually learning what we're teaching.
One comment on that, I know Jesse, you would agree with this. We're not saying that teachers are 100% responsible for student learning, because the student has to also engage in the learning process. However, the teacher is still the number one influence on a child's learning. Always has, always will be. And if that's the case, how we spend our time and how we give our feedback is very important to the student.
So another area that I think we need to look at is just this idea that there are still some outdated assumptions that we are holding on to that may be continuing to hold us back. And it may be time to reevaluate them and consider if they're still relevant assumptions today, or if we need to let them go. Can you give some examples of areas where there may be outdated assumptions that are holding back schools from making really good progress in the area of teaching and learning?
I'll give two. And the first one's simple and similar to what we just talked about with scope and sequence and timing. The old adage of, if you teach to the middle, as you said, you just kind of move on when most of the kids get it. But then over time, I used to always use a Swiss cheese analogy. If a child's learning is a piece of cheese, then over time, those holes keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. If they're that one student, or the 3 or 4 students that didn't get the content when you decide to move on, or the 3 or 4 or 5 other kids on the other end that were bored out of their mind, what they could have been learning also starts to grow, because that's a deficit that they could have had filled if their learning was geared somewhere else. The second one, I think this is even more significant, is the idea of grading. And if you want to get people upset, you throw some educators, school leaders, and teachers in a room, you start talking about grading. So I apologize again for the second reference on the coaching model, but I think it just helps to understand the differences potentially in what we have been doing when it comes to academics, and just some other ways to do business. If you decide as a school you're going to keep doing what you're doing, that's totally fine, but be aware of some other ways to approach assessment. So in the coaching model, we practice, we train, and I love that word, we train our students or our athletes to do certain things. Then they have these period of time where they have an event, they call that a game, and they go out there and they perform. And during the whole time, the coach is coaching, providing constant feedback. However, games are unique because that might be like a chapter test for a teacher. That's when, okay, how did all the pieces come together for this one big game? And when after the game is over, as a coach, you also reflect, wow, what did I do well as a coach? What did I not do well? What do most of the student athletes in this case, what are they not able to do? I better help them. And so you're constantly now telling yourself how you're going to approach the next week of practice, so some of those same issues do not reappear in game 2, and so on. I think that's the mindset of grading. And we'll talk more specifics in future episodes, but let me just say this. We treat grading a lot the same way, in the sense that we have the teach to the middle mindset and not so much of the coaching feedback mindset. We see grading, generally speaking, as a very static, a one-time event. Your life is an 84. Well, what if the child learns it the next Tuesday? Or, it's so funny. It just throws our minds off when we think this way. The other outdated assumption is that learning is a static thing that just happens at that moment and can never be done again a second time or a third time. And I'm not just talking about retesting and those types of so-called controversial things. I'm talking about the idea that if a child hasn't learned something, or if the athlete hasn't learned something, as a good teacher or coach, what am I going to do about that? And I think that's the old assumption that we have to challenge in our day.
So yeah, what you just described leads to what I call point chasing, where the child is not nearly as concerned about learning or the depth of knowledge or degree of mastery. It's all about points. And they figure out the game, how to math the system, where, okay, I know I just got to get to an 84 to average out over a 90 and get that A minus or whatever. So I get whatever carrot comes along with that, whether it's a reward from parents or a scholarship or admission to the college that, I feel like is where I want to be. And point chasing can be really harmful to a student, to mindset, and just it's like the antithesis of mastery and true learning. So I'm really glad you brought up, getting an 84.
Jesse, another outdated assumption that you and I have spoke of many different times, this idea of, well, it's always worked for us. And tell me about why that assumption obviously gets us into some trouble.
One of the things I observed it with myself and I observed it with other teachers that I supervise, is that teachers either teach A, the way we were taught, which is most often, or B, then the way our college professors taught, or C, the way our mentored teachers in our student teaching programs taught. But most often it's either A, the way we were taught, or B, the way that our professors taught us, which is still the way we were taught. And then I hear the same thing from parents regularly too, as well. It worked in the 90s when we were all in school, but there's been such just evolution, and I don't mean that in a controversial way, just evolution of the child, or in my case, the adolescent mind. It's grown and changed so much that we've always done it this way. And well, it worked for us. It's just not a successful and effective strategy that we can camp out on anymore.
Jesse, give me your hot take for rethinking academics in our schools.
If you teach to the middle, you leave out 2/3. And just because the curriculum guide may say you've got to get through all 16 chapters, if you know you can realistically and reasonably either get through 3/4 of each chapter or get through the most important 12, you identify power standards that you get through and communicate with either your department head or your teacher coach and the grade level above you about what you're reasonably going to shoot for, and then make adjustments as necessary as you go through the year, I think you'll be okay. All right, Jared, how about you? What's a hot take for this episode?
Feedback, it's more important than ever. And if there's one shift in the way that we think about education that needs to be probably brought to the forefront, it's feedback. The days of simply just teaching to the middle, giving a score and moving on are long gone. We should be in the business of, what does this child need? And to the best of my ability, within a reasonable time frame, what can I do to provide that feedback to move them on, whether that's they need more support or need more challenge. We know it takes a great teacher to do this well, but our kids' education is at stake. Feedback is the way to go.
If we truly believe every child matters and that every student can grow, then our academic systems should be built to support real learning, not just maintaining habit or tradition. In the next episode, we'll get practical. We'll talk strategies about how schools can redesign learning in ways that actually work without chasing any trends. Thanks for listening to this episode of I Demand a Meeting. We'd love to connect with you, leave a comment or drop us a note. We'd love to engage. Tell us about your own experience. We look forward to seeing you next week.